Welcome to The Reality Taboo, where no topic is off limits. It's March 28, 2026. I'm Jeff. Joining me is my co-host, Ness. Topic today is The Managerial Revolution by James Burnham. The term managerial state is used a lot in dissident right circles and paleo-conservative circles. Ness brought it to my attention. I had not heard of the term. He uses it a lot, and I was not really sure what it meant. It sounded a bit like the deep state to me, and so I decided to read Burnham's book for myself. So, Ness, when you use the term managerial state, what are you thinking?
I use it primarily because of its intellectual pedigree. It's not my preferred term to get at the idea of what the power centers are and how culture is made and how influence and power is wielded. I prefer the term globo homo because of its double meaning and innuendo and descriptive value. People know global homogenation. That makes more sense to people who are not acquainted with the ideas, more sense than something like managerial state, which sounds inherently academic, but it does have a pedigree that spans multiple generations now, and so academically it is more recognizable than globo homo. But as we covered a few weeks ago, I think there are several different bodies of thought that approach something that is similar. If there is a Venn diagram, there's a lot of overlap between globo homo and the managerial state, but they're not exactly the same thing.
I think of globo homo as pushing more cultural values of tolerance and the normalization of homosexuality and other sexually deviant behaviors. And why I don't think it really overlaps with managerial state, because I would describe China as a managerial state, and they certainly don't push the homo globo agenda, but there is similarities between the structure of government in bureaucracy and bureaucratic control. There are similarities between the West and China, but they're not both pushing globo homo. So I'm going to turn to George Orwell, who I, in the midst of researching, or actually just purchasing the book, the edition of the book I had Orwell's 1946 essay on Burnham at the beginning, before the text of Burnham. And Orwell engaged very rigorous or very in-depth with Burnham. He disagreed with a lot of it, but he certainly found a lot of value, and so it's not at all. Orwell certainly critiques the theory, but it's not at all a straw man argument. It's a good faith argument that Orwell engages in, and so here is Orwell, I think, fairly summarizing Burnham's thesis is as follows: Capitalism is disappearing, but socialism is not replacing it. What is now arising is a new kind of planned, centralized society which will be neither capitalist nor, in any accepted sense of the word, democratic. The rulers of this new society will be the people who effectively control the means of production, that is, business executives, technicians, bureaucrats, and soldiers, lumped together by Burnham under the name of managers. These people will eliminate the old capitalist class, crush the working class, and so organize society that all power and economic privilege remain in their own hands. Private property rights will be abolished, but common ownership will not be established. The new managerial society will not consist of a patchwork of small independent states, but of great superstates grouped around the main industrial centers in Europe, Asia, and America. These superstates will fight among themselves for possession of the remaining uncaptured portions of the earth, but will probably be unable to conquer one another completely. Internally, each society will be hierarchical, with an aristocracy of talent at the top and a mass of semi-slaves at the bottom. So to give a little bit of context on Burnham, he was a Trotskyite, meaning a follower of Leon Trotsky, up until 1940, when he split with the Trotskyites. I don't know if Trotsky was still alive at that point, but Burnham kind of moved away from Marxism and concluded that orthodox Marxism was simply wrong, not in its analysis of capitalism's contradictions, but in its prediction of what came next. So Burnham presents managerialism as a new epoch of human society, where he puts it in context of, at least in Europe, there was feudalism, which gave way to capitalism. And now capitalism was giving way to managerialism. And the prevailing orthodoxy, at least as Burnham describes it in the 1930s and early 1940s, was that, at least among Marxists, capitalism was on its way out, but it was the only possible replacement for capitalism would be socialism. And that's what Burnham thought was completely wrong. He said he agreed that capitalism was on its way out, but he did not agree that socialism would follow. And he goes into great detail, really three test countries he focuses on the most, which were relevant at the time, which were Russia, Germany, and the United States. And I think most convincingly, he talks about how obviously what followed the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia was not socialism in any, he makes the point that any hardcore Marxist who described socialism in 1916, they would not describe anywhere near what the USSR was under Lenin and then under Stalin. So any reasonable definition of socialism, the USSR did not meet it. Burnham also says clearly this is not capitalism either. It is something else. It is managerialism. So Burnham goes into more detail on certain characteristics of capitalism and how those characteristics were not present in feudalism, which preceded capitalism, and how they were certain aspects of capitalism were becoming less relevant because we were moving from capitalism to managerialism. One key thing he talks about is in capitalism, at least in theory, you have the limited state, and the capitalist state intervened in the economic process, but those interventions never went beyond a fairly narrow limit. Any deeper incursion by the state into the economy would destroy individual property rights and therefore end capitalist economic relationships. To try to drill down on what a manager is in Burnham's theory, in his book, he talks about 4 groups that all have some relationship to the instruments of production, to use a Marxian term, which, again, Burnham's background in Marxism is very apparent. He uses a lot of the same terminology from Marxism, so one of those is instruments of production. And so the 4 groups, first group is the managers, those who direct the actual technical process of production. Those would be like plant superintendents, operating executives, production managers. These are the people without whom the factory literally couldn't function. Group 2 are the executives, those who guide the enterprise toward profit, selling, financing, bargaining over prices. And then group 3 are the finance capitalists, the bankers, the financiers, the holding company operators. And then group 4 are the stockholders, the nominal legal owners of the corporation, but even in Burnham's time, and certainly true now, in large modern corporations, they are almost entirely passive. So as Burnham describes it, in early capitalism, one man often occupied all 4 positions simultaneously. But he says that today, as in 1940, these functions have been separated. And so the managers of Group 1, which again he labeled as the managers, they are gaining real control while the finance capitalists and stockholders are losing it. And then here's a quote from Burnham: "Ownership means control. If there is no control, then there is no ownership. Those who control are the owners." This struck me as off because as I look at it, finance capitalists, which is group 3 in Burnham's description, have tremendous power in modern society. So he seems to be discounting the power and control that they have. Maybe the argument would be that those entities, the financiers, the bankers, JP Morgan Chase, Bear Stearns in 2008, they did all act in subordination to the deep state or the managerial state or the alphabet agencies of the federal government. At the end of the day, the banks, when they were in crisis, they needed the help of the managerial state, and they were at the mercies of the managerial state. So maybe that's what Burnham would say.
Effectively, all 4 of those groups are now interchangeable in terms of what they believe, what they publicly profess to believe, and what they try to execute in terms of what institutions do, what the power centers do, and what cultural shaping institutions do. They all have the same beliefs about all of the major questions of the day. The executives at JP Morgan and the investor classes, the big money hedge funds, and the upper level management that actually manages the day-to-day operations of JP Morgan Chase, they all believe the same thing. I think that is what is more crucial in understanding how things play out today, and why, again, Globo Homo is a more useful conceptual framework for understanding how things operate. The managerial state is the mechanism, but Globo Homo is the animating force, and the practitioners of the managerial state at every level all believe effectively the same thing, and without having to communicate in some conspiratorial back room, all already believe the same things, because that is what so much of modernity is based on inculcating in everyone who operates inside of the managerial state at all of those different levels that Jeff laid out. So I think the interesting thing to focus on is not so much between whether the managers proper, or the executives, or the financiers, or the stockholders ultimately have the decision-making power, but instead that the structure reinforces itself so that all members of good standing in all four of those categories all effectively believe the same thing, and treat as an allergy any sort of attempt from the outside to try to change those things.
So for Burnham, Russia is the most powerful evidence against the socialist theory, and he talks about how, based on his best reading of Soviet statistics, were inherently not super reliable, but from what he could gather, about 11 to 12% of the Soviet population received approximately 50% of national income, which was a ratio of inequality way more extreme than in the United States. And so the idea that the USSR represented any sort of true socialism was absurd on its face, because a central element of socialism is a classless society, and the USSR had an extreme concentration of wealth. And regarding Germany, the common Marxist view of Nazism was viewing Nazism as decadent capitalism, as in the last brutal stage of a dying system. And Burnham argues that Germany was actually dismantling capitalist property relations, subordinating private enterprise to state direction, and deploying the full productive capacity of its economy towards national ends, not for profit, but for power. And so Burnham concludes that both Russian communism and German fascism, which seem, at least they were presented as being polar opposites, they actually serve the same structural function. Quoting from Burnham, "The communist and fascist doctrine is a device, and an effective one, for enlisting the support of the masses for the interests of the new elite through an apparent identification of those interests with the interests of the masses themselves." As an American, Burnham's discussion of the United States in the context of the managerial state was of most interest to me. And in Burnham's view, again, this book, The Managerial Revolution, was written in 1940, published in 1941. So in Burnham's view, America was not yet a managerial state. It remained the most thoroughly capitalist of the major powers. But the New Deal was the mechanism by which it was becoming managerial. And Burnham distinguishes between New Dealism and socialism. Roosevelt was not abolishing private property, but expanding the state's role in ways that structurally reduce the domain of capitalist property relations without formally eliminating them. So, quoting from Burnham again, "The New Deal sprang from the inner structural drives of modern society, the forces that are operating to end capitalism and begin a new type of social organization, the same forces which at later stages and under different local circumstances produced the revolutions in Russia and Germany." Burnham says that capitalists, however, were correct to fear the New Deal. Quoting from him, "The capitalists opposed the New Deal because they realized, without being fully clear about the full problem, the truth, that the New Deal is in direction and tendency anti-capitalist." So when looking at the United States and what followed from the New Deal, which was certainly a hinge point in American history, I would describe what emerged during and after the New Deal and extending into 2026. I like the term deep state, if we're talking about terminology, where all of these alphabet agencies were set up, the SEC, the FDA, the National Labor Relations Board. There were all kinds of bureaucracies established in the 1930s and 40s and 50s and onward. And those agencies are staffed by career civil servants, and many of the key players who are the managers, as Burnham would describe them, they remain in place regardless of the president. And this is also where I push back against the term globo homo really being the same thing, because in the 1930s, when the American managerial state, so to speak, was being constructed, the apparatus acted to push very specific interests of white people at the expense of black people, where many of the New Deal programs the funds were only given to white people. Redlining was often an explicit policy of the federal government, and when public housing projects were being constructed, they were generally made for the benefit of white people and were laid out in such a way that white people wouldn't have to live near blacks. And so that is obviously complete opposite of globo homo, at least as it would be described in 2026. So again, important separation. I don't know if this analogy works, but you could say maybe that the managerial state is the hardware, the system in place that can be tuned and set to whatever settings you want necessarily. You could push an extreme right-wing reactionary agenda. You could close the borders. You could do whatever government policy you want, or you could have more similar, I think, to what Ness thinks we have today, which is a managerial state that pushes a libertine, degenerate set of values.
I'm a little confused. So you're saying that you think deep state is a good descriptor for the 1930s, but is no longer a good descriptor, because by distinguishing between the deep state of the 1930s with the New Deal and the contemporary use of the term globo homo and saying that those don't push the same things, well, neither does the deep state of 1930s compared to the deep state of the 2020s.
I think, at least my conception of globo homo is, first of all, it contains the word homo in it, so it's inherently a slur. It has a negative view of homosexuality, and more broadly, it's a term that is used by people who would advocate a more puritanical society where chastity is important and women don't have sex out of wedlock, and men and women conduct themselves in a chaste manner. That's why you use the term homo, because nobody who likes homosexuality would use that term. And so that is a specific ideology, a set of beliefs and morality, versus the deep state / managerial state is just a mechanism. It's machinery that you can use to push globo homo, or, as they did in the 1930s, you can push a more right-wing, reactionary, pro-white agenda. Those are, in a lot of ways, diametrically opposed ideologies, but they can both be furthered and disseminated using the deep state / managerial state. A
lot of this can be drilled down to semantics, and I think in the case of globo homo, that is very much the case. It was a term that was coined by Hartiste, who certainly is not one who, especially at the time that he coined it, had any problem with women being promiscuous or chastity being some sort of inherent virtue. Quite the opposite. And it comes from a very Xer perspective, Gen Xer perspective, where homo is used as an all-purpose insult. The focus is not really on homosexuality at all, beyond the fact that it's sort of a clever play on words, but the homo, the important part of that globo homo, is the homogenization of everything, the idea that everything conforms to the same outlook. And to the extent that it interfaces with questions of homosexuality at all, it is that the respectable position that everyone is expected to hold if they want to be in good standing in the managerial state or in globo homo, or whatever term you want to use, is that they approve of homosexual relations and don't find any problem with it.
Okay, maybe I just don't know enough about that term and all that's contained within it, because I seem to recall my exposure to global homo was I just picture like memes of a child dressed in drag outfit at a gay pride parade in Seattle, and there's some reference to global homo, and this is like the apotheosis of global homo society. It is a kid in a drag outfit at a pride festival.
But that's the same thing that anyone in good standing in the deep state would approve of as well.
I think that's overstating it. I don't think that kind of I mean, certainly not in the Trump administration. That would get you kicked out immediately if you expressed any sort of support for that in 2026. So I just don't think that's accurate.
Well, yes, what Globo Homo pushes does not stay static over time. That was the point I was trying to make when you were bringing up the differences in the deep state of the 1930s and the Globo Homo of the 2020s, but there is as wide a gulf there as there is between the deep state of the 1930s and the deep state of the 2020s in terms of what they push. And so, yes, the Globo Homo of 2020 is different than Globo Homo of 2025.
But if something, you would argue, again, that in global homo, it's not exclusively homosexuality, but that is a part of it. Included within global homo is a permissiveness and an acceptance and a glorification, probably even, of homosexual activity. And you conflate that with the deep state, but the deep state implies that regardless of administration, the same fundamental ideology is being pushed. But we see right now with just from Biden to Trump 47, there's going to complete 180 as far as acceptance of that kind of degenerate behavior, because I think you would agree that anybody in the Trump administration who is celebrating gay pride parades would be immediately fired.
No, I would think it is a mischaracterization to say that there's been a 180 from 2020 compared to 2025. The Republican Party, as it is with Trump as its avatar, is far more openly accepting of homosexuality, including in the second Trump administration, than even the Republican Party of George W. Bush was 20 years ago. It's not called globopedo. If that were the case, then maybe I think the argument would have more purchase. But I think as it is, yes, very much so, globo homo's orientation towards homosexuality remains effectively unchanged from where it was 5 years ago. Certainly the differences in terms of how globo homo broadly defined, how the managerial class looks at homosexuality has not changed in a significant way, I don't think, in the last 5 years. But I think that also gets back to the semantic problems here. I take that globo homo is not necessarily the most descriptive term, although I think that's why I visited this topic weeks ago, because none of these terms are fully satisfactory, and the very nature of power and cultural shaping influence, the fact that it's constantly changing, makes it difficult to come up with a single term that really pins it down. But even our focus here on homosexuality, which is not what globo homo is intended to describe, at least not exclusively. It is trying to much more ambitiously get at the idea of how culture in general is shaped and reinforced. In the same way that the managerial state or the deep state has a set of reinforced cultural sensibilities and outlooks that everyone who is to remain a member of good standing inside of that system is expected to hold.
Returning to George Orwell's critique of the Managerial Revolution, Orwell, I think, rightfully points out that Burnham got a lot of things, big things, completely wrong. And Orwell describes it thusly, quote, "At each point, Burnham is predicting a continuation of the thing that is happening. Now, the tendency to do this is not simply a bad habit like inaccuracy or exaggeration, which one can correct by taking thought. It is a major mental disease, and its roots lie partly in cowardice and partly in the worship of power, which is not fully separable from cowardice. power worship blurs political judgment because it leads, almost unavoidably, to the belief that present trends will continue. Whoever is winning at the moment will always seem to be invincible. So again, Burnham was writing in 1940, and in his book, he forecast that Germany was bound to win the war, that Germany and Japan were bound to remain the nuclei of power in their respective areas, that Germany would not attack the USSR until the defeat of Britain, and that the USSR was bound to be defeated. Obviously, all four of these predictions were wrong. And so that is something I think I detect in critiques from the right of the deep state and the managerial state. It's almost a sense of hopelessness and despair, and almost projecting undue power and influence on these institutions, these powers. And I think that led to a lot of people finding it inconceivable that, Trump maybe slipped through the first time. There's no way he would be able to slip through and get into power a second time, because the deep state learned its lesson. It was kind of caught off guard in 2016. It got everything ready. It was so powerful that it was never going to allow Trump to take power in 2024. I think that kind of manifests in different ways. I think, and so that's why the power worship critique that Orwell talked about really resonated with me.
I think to the contrary, it underscores the power of the system, and how those of us on the dissident right, or the outside looking in, those who the system is designed to grind into dust and to keep out of positions of being able to influence the direction that the state, that globo homo, moves in, such that we can't even understand the mechanisms by which that would play out, because many of the people who predicted that the system would not allow Trump to win assumed it was because if he did, he would come back and change the system. But what we see instead is that the system has been able to, even with Trump, has been able to convert Trump, this person who made his political career out of being the one allergy that the system couldn't handle. He has been entirely converted by the system, such that in many ways, especially with his military industrial complex and what the deep state exists to do on an international basis, has, rather than being some wrecking ball that comes in from the outside, has been an even more emphatic, zealot pusher of the cause of the system than the people who he ostensibly was coming in to replace.
Yes, that I agree completely with the foreign policy. That's a whole separate discussion. That this whole Iran situation is perplexing in a lot of ways. I have no idea what's going on there. I think, though, on other issues, Trump, and again, it's hard to know how much of this is smoke and mirrors and how much of it is kabuki theater, and it's just putting on Trump's just putting on a show to placate the MAGA masses and think things are happening, but they're not. I mean, maybe that's the case. Having said that, the fact that there is, again, if you trust the statistics and the line, haven't seen any dispute of this, but the border's closed. There is almost no illegal aliens coming in through the border. So that does not seem like, I think Ness would agree that open borders is a key component of global homo. Well, it's hard to argue that open borders is being pushed when the borders are closed. And there are, again, certainly not as many as we'd like, but there are deportations happening. So I guess if Trump has been absorbed by the deep state, then why would there be open border, or why wouldn't there be open borders like there was during the Biden administration?
The deep state, such as it is, doesn't have to get its way 100% of the time on every facet of its operations at all times. The real question here is whether or not the borders remain closed in 2, 3, 4 years' time, or if the trend that the globo homo, the the deep state has pushed for continues or not. And that is the point I'm trying to underscore here, is that getting caught up on specific policy prescriptions at specific points in time misses the forest for the trees. The take-home message is that Globo Homo pushes in a direction that effectively can't be changed, certainly not significantly changed over an extended period of time, but that instead it just absorbs everything. Another analogy or another metaphor I like to use is the great nothing from The Never-Ending Story, which was Jack Donovan's characterization. That's the term he uses. If it's not Globo Homo, then the great nothing is probably the one that I prefer next. But the idea is that over time, everything that tries to contest Globo Homo just instead gets absorbed by it. So the question I guess I would put to Jeff is, if the putative progress at pushing back Globo Homo or the deep state that has been made in the second Trump administration, particularly on the point of illegal immigration into the United States, if that is reversed in 3 or 4 years' time, how is that interpreted? Because I think what they're going to want, what the system wants you to think, is that, well, yes, the system reverted to how it had been previously, but we really did have a shot there, and Trump was really close to pushing a systematic change that would have challenged what Globo Homo was pushing for, but we just missed the opportunity. Where what I'm positing is that it is effectively a fait accompli, that in 3 or 4 years' time, that the immigration situation will be effectively indistinguishable from what it was during the Biden administration.
I'm going to give a pretty conventional take. I think if the Democrats win in 2028, we're going to have open borders. Now, I do not think the open borders will be as bad as they were during the Biden administration. I think the floodgates will open maybe halfway to what they were under the Biden administration. I think if the Republicans win, if J.D. Vance wins, I think he'll continue the Trump administration policy on the border, assuming that he can continue getting adequate funding. So I really think it depends on whether the Republicans or the Democrats win. And then if it's a Trump acolyte like Vance, I think the policies will continue as they are under Trump 47. And then it would depend, if the Democrats win, it would depend on who specifically won, whether it was again, that gets back to our three areas, 3 different individuals we looked at who could potentially represent the Democratic Party in 2028. I think if it's AOC Bernie type, it's going to be wide open borders, which is kind of ironic because Bernie used to be pretty hawkish on the border, but that's changed so much. That's a different story. But I think that branch of the Democratic Party would be the most open borders. The Jasmine Crockett would be the middle, and then the Gavin Newsom would be the lead. There would still be open borders, but they would be not as open as they would be under the other two.
So the national immigration orientation the federal orientation towards immigration would be, do you think, comparable to what it has been under Gavin Newsom's governorship in California at the state level?
I don't know what it's been like specifically, I guess, down in San Diego with that area of the border. I don't think that's considered one of the most porous sections. I think it's more of the illegal entry comes in the Rio Grande, Texas sector, but I'm not entirely sure. But I think the point is that I think what you're saying is basically you vote for, you can have the illusion of voting, but Global Homo is going to get what it wants regardless. There might be some kabuki theater and they might change places, but the fundamental policy is going to be the same. And I disagree with that. I think immigration, we've shown, I don't think you can get a bigger contrast almost between Biden and Trump 47 in terms of the status of the border. And to lump those together and say there's not meaningful differences between the two, I just think is completely missing the point, or is missing reality. And I think to me, again, it seems like it's more shoehorning in this deep state theory or this global homo theory to accommodate things that are, in my opinion, obviously diametrically opposed. And because you have to reconcile them and say they're actually the same, you're saying that two things that are very different are actually the same, which doesn't make sense to me.
Yeah, I think it's what you put the emphasis on. You put the emphasis on specific policy prescriptions at particular periods of time, or do you take a longer view to see where inexorably the cultural shaping power is being condensed? Because, of course, we could make the same argument. By your argument, there is really no relationship whatsoever between the deep state of the 1920s and the deep state of the 2020s. Or am I mischaracterizing that? Because in terms of the policy prescriptions, they are almost uniformly different than what they are today. But I think the more important point is that they, in terms of how much ability to shape culture and influence in the direction of society outside of the deep state, that comparing that in the 1920s or the 1930s to the 2020s today, the amount of room for effective cultural shaping power to come outside of the deep state is what has dwindled over time and will continue to dwindle. And apropos of that, looking at some economist YouGov polling this week, I was struck by the fact that to the question of whether or not respondents supported military interventionism in Iran, that those who self-described as MAGA, which constituted about half of Republican Party members, people who identified as Republicans, there were about half of those who identified as Republican identified as MAGA. And among the Republicans who identified as MAGA, they were more supportive of military action in Iran than were Republicans who did not identify as MAGA. And so given that the general understanding of what Trump represents in terms of a break from previous iterations of Republican presidents and presidential aspirants is a less interventionist foreign policy for self-described MAGA members to be the most strident supporters of military interventionism seems, or might seem at first blush, to be confusing. But I was reminded from 15 years ago, digging into the data during the 2012 Republican primary process when the Tea Party was all the rage. And in a lot of ways, the Tea Party can be conceived of as a precursor to the MAGA movement. The self-described Tea Partiers were most likely to support Mitt Romney in the Republican primaries and caucuses, and least likely to support Ron Paul, even though Mitt Romney, for all intents and purposes, represented a continuation of big government deficit spending republicanism, and Ron Paul was the polar opposite of that. And in 2008, the Tea Party movement, when it was in much more infant stages, was associated with Ron Paul, and a lot of the people who self-described as Tea Partiers at the time were Ron Paul supporters. But as that terminology and that branding was absorbed by the Republican Party apparatus, which on a smaller scale sort of represents what Globo Homo does and what the deep state does, as that useful terminology was absorbed by the Republican Party, it was such that by 2012, the putative insurgent force that was the Tea Party had become absorbed entirely by the apparatus of the Republican Party, and such that effectively what being a Tea Party member meant is that you were an especially highly partisan and motivated Republican. And I think we can see the same phenomenon taking place with those who self-identify as members of the MAGA movement, such that in 2015, 2016, MAGA was an insurgent force in the Republican Party that was going to steer it in a different direction, whereas now, a decade later, the Globo Homo continues to do what Globo Homo wants to do, what Globo Homo has wanted to do on a bipartisan basis for a long time, which is in particular attack Iran and topple the Iranian regime. We see now that MAGA, in fact, is no longer is MAGA some insurgent force that's trying to push the party away from that interventionism, but instead that is now the strongest support for this military interventionism and the continuation of what Globo Homo is pushing for.
Shifting gears a bit to a current event that I think will fit in nicely into what we've been talking about. Robert Mueller died on March 20th at the age of 81. He went to Princeton, was in the Marine Corps, fought in Vietnam, was awarded the Bronze Star, the Purple Heart, went to law school at the University of Virginia, was a federal prosecutor, was head of the Justice Department's criminal division. He was FBI director for 12 years, second longest tenure in the Bureau's history after J. Edgar Hoover. He was actually appointed FBI director I want to say a week before 9/11. And then he was most recently and perhaps most famously the special counsel overseeing the investigation into supposed Russian interference in the 2016 presidential election. So Trump issued a statement about Mueller's death. Quote, "Good. I'm glad he's dead. He can no longer hurt innocent people!" Exclamation point. So I would argue that Mueller is a perfect illustration of what the managerial class that Burnham talked about looks like from the inside. So the managers that Burnham described and that we discussed, there's perhaps no better illustration of that or personification of that than Robert Mueller. He served under both Republican and Democratic presidents, and that is a defining feature of the managerial class as Burnham describes it. It's not partisan, it's institutional, and its loyalty is to the apparatus, not to any particular political program.
Not politically partisan, but there is a reason for that, and it is not because it is somehow that members of the managerial class are somehow above politics, but instead that the managerial system relies on the perception that there is some sort of competing interest that those outside of the managerial class can influence how the managerial class operates. That is so essential to how the managerial class is able to totally snuff out the will of those on the outside. So while he wasn't partisan in a political sense, he was the most reliable type of soldier for the managerial class, specifically because he was not politically partisan, but instead he was a partisan of the managerial state more broadly.
And so when Mueller took over the FBI, like I said, about a week or two into his tenure, 9/11 occurred. And so then Mueller took over domestic crime-fighting agency and remade it into a powerful international counterintelligence organization. He expanded the institutional jurisdiction. He shifted its locus of activity outward and upward and made it less constrained by the ordinary legal boundaries that govern domestic law enforcement. And I think this is textbook managerial behavior. It is the expansion of the authority of the institution, the growth of technical complexity, and the accumulation of expertise that makes the institution indispensable. And it is furthermore even less accountable to democratic control. Burnham wrote in the managerial state, quote, "They know," meaning the managers, "they know they are indispensable in modern society. Whether or not they have thought it out, they grasp the fact that they have nothing to fear from the immense social changes speeding forward over the whole world." This describes Mueller and the bearing of the entire apparatus he represented. The calm of a man who has never seriously questioned whether the institution he serves is legitimate, because to Mueller, or to people like him, legitimacy is the institution.
That's the crux of the response to Trump's disparaging remarks about Robert Mueller having passed. If he is viewed as an individual human being, then it seems callous and in very obvious poor taste. But if he is instead viewed as a cipher, as a hollow man, a totally interchangeable cog in the managerial system that has no independent thoughts of his own, then disparaging that is the most classic Trumpian move that can be imagined. And as Jeff said, Robert Mueller is the perfect avatar for a manager in the managerial state. And his vegetable testimony when he was giving the findings of the Mueller investigation, where he was incoherent and couldn't seem to remember anything, was just the perfect exclamation point of a life of someone who was always hollow, was the ultimate hollow man, the ultimate soldier of the managerial state, who was able to accumulate a lot of power and prestige operating in the system, but only and exclusively insofar as he was able to adhere to exactly what the system demanded. And in particular, zeroing in on the accusation that Mueller hurt innocent people as the reason given for Trump's celebration at his demise, this is not something at all new to Robert Mueller, nor is it something new to the Globo Homo managerial state. That's what it constantly, perpetually does to any potential challenges to its power, or just to anyone it identifies for whatever reason needs to be destroyed. It will destroy them, innocent or otherwise, as long as they don't have any power to fight back. Their innocence or lack thereof is largely incidental. Reading from a summation that Claude provided about Stephen Hatfield, and this is all the way back in the early 2000s, quote, "This is probably the most egregious example. Hatfield came to worldwide attention in 2002 as a suspect in the 2001 anthrax attacks, a charge of which he was eventually exonerated and later compensated for after extensive litigation. Mueller micromanaged the anthrax case and fell in love with dubious bloodhound evidence, personally assuring Attorney General Ashcroft and President Bush that in Stephen Hatfield the Bureau had its man. There was no direct link from Hatfield to the attacks by the FBI's own admission, and the Bureau never charged Hatfield. Yet the FBI spied on, followed, and harassed him nonstop for years. His home was repeatedly raided, his phone was tapped, he was extensively surveilled for more than 2 years, and he was terminated from his job. In 2008, the government settled Hatfield's lawsuit with a $4.6 million annuity totaling $5.8 million in payment, and the government officially exonerated him of any involvement. When asked about it, Mueller stated, "I do not apologize for any aspect of the investigation. It would be erroneous to say there were mistakes." And this was said the day before the DOJ formally exonerated Hatfield in writing. And this is the third high-profile late person who Trump has famously or infamously disparaged upon death. The other ones prior to Robert Mueller being John McCain and Rob Reiner. And if Robert Mueller represents the faceless bureaucrat in the managerial system, John McCain represents more the political face, and Robert Reiner the cultural degeneracy that Globo Homo pushes to sap the will of any potential cultural resistance from the outside. So even if Trump has effectively been totally subsumed by Globo Homo, these instincts for identifying the most deserving targets for his personal invective remain as sharp as ever. I respect the desire for decorum, but the three late people Trump controversially has insulted at their deaths have all been people who have been terrible for Heritage America, while simultaneously being those celebrated most vociferously by Globo Homo. I won't lose any sleep as they fume at his words while they look up from the flames. And on that very classy note, we'll end it for this week. Thanks for listening. We'll talk to you next time.
you.